A commoner was on her usual evening walk through the woods when she stumbled upon something that made her heart stop. A stranger, lying on the ground, bleeding and barely conscious. She didn't know who he was or how he got there, but what she did next would change her life forever. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Once upon a time, in a land where thick forests stretched as far as the eye could see, there lived a young maiden named Mara. She had neither mother nor father, for they had been taken by a fever when she was but a child. Now she lived alone in a small cottage at the very edge of a great forest, surviving by her wits and the generosity of the earth. Every day, from dawn until dusk, Mara would walk into the woods to gather mushrooms and berries, which she would carefully bundle in cloth and take to the market in the nearby village. The coins she earned were barely enough to buy bread and keep her small fire burning through the cold nights. But Mara never complained. She knew that many had far less than she did. One cold autumn morning, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson and the first frost had touched the ground, Mara set out earlier than usual. The mushroom season was nearly at its end, and she was desperate to gather the last of the harvest before winter descended in earnest. She walked deeper into the forest than she had ever dared to walk before, following a narrow path that wound between ancient oak trees whose gnarled roots clutched at the earth like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder as she ventured further from her cottage, and a thick mist hung between the trees, muting all sound. It was in this eerie silence that Mara heard a terrible sound. A low, agonized groaning that seemed to come from somewhere nearby. At first, she thought it might be an animal caught in a trap, but as she crept closer, following the sound through the mist, she realized it was the voice of a man in terrible pain. Her heart pounding, Mara pushed through a thicket of brambles and found herself in a small clearing beneath an enormous oak tree. There, sprawled upon the frost-covered ground, lay a young man. His fine clothes were torn and soaked with blood, and a deep wound ran across his shoulder, the blood still seeping through the fabric. His face was as pale as death itself, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Mara fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling. She had seen death before in the village, in the forest, and she knew its marks well. This man was very close to crossing that threshold from which there is no return. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his face. His skin was cold as ice. The stranger's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and clouded with pain. His lips moved, and Mara leaned close to hear his whispered words. "Where are you hurt?" Mara asked urgently, though she could already see the terrible wound. The stranger could barely speak, but he lifted one trembling hand and pointed weakly to his shoulder. Mara quickly assessed the situation. The wound was deep and had bled profusely, but if she could staunch the bleeding and get him to warmth, there might be hope. She knew she must help this man, or he would surely die before nightfall. Without hesitation, she grabbed the hem of her worn skirt and began tearing strips from the fabric, ignoring the cold air that now touched her legs. Working as carefully as her shaking hands would allow, she bound his wounds as best she could, wrapping the makeshift bandages tightly to slow the bleeding. Then, with strength she didn't know she possessed, Mara helped the stranger to his feet, though he could barely stand and his weight nearly pulled her down. The journey back to the cottage was agonizing. The stranger leaned heavily upon Mara's small frame, his feet stumbling over roots and stones. Several times he nearly fell, and each time Mara had to brace herself against his weight, her muscles screaming in protest. The path that had taken her less than an hour to walk now seemed endless. The mist grew thicker around them, and Mara began to fear she had lost her way. But she pressed on, half carrying, half dragging the wounded man through the forest. His breathing grew more labored with each step, and occasionally he would murmur words she could not understand, lost in a fever that was beginning to take hold. When at last they broke through the tree line and her small cottage came into view, Mara felt tears of relief sting her eyes. With a final burst of effort, she guided the stranger through the door and laid him upon her own bed, the only bed in the cottage. It was a simple wooden frame covered with a straw mattress and a threadbare blanket, but it was clean and dry, and it would have to suffice. The stranger collapsed onto it with a groan, his eyes closing almost immediately. Mara wasted no time. She built up the fire in the hearth until the room was warm, then set water to heat in her only pot. As the water warmed, Mara carefully removed the makeshift bandages she had applied in the forest. The sight beneath them made her stomach turn. The wound was even deeper than she had thought, running from his shoulder nearly to his chest, and the edges were jagged and raw. She feared he had lost too much blood. Working with trembling hands, she cleaned the wound as thoroughly as she could, washing away the dried blood and dirt. The man drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, occasionally crying out in pain when she had to probe the wound to ensure no dirt or debris remained. Mara had learned the ways of healing herbs from an old woman who had once lived deep in the forest, a woman who had shown kindness to a frightened orphan girl many years ago. Now, Mara went to her small cupboard and took out dried yarrow and comfrey precious supplies she had gathered during the summer months. She crushed the herbs carefully and mixed them with a bit of the warm water to make a thick poultice, which she then placed upon the stranger's wounds. The mixture would help staunch the bleeding and prevent infection, if the spirits were kind. Next, she made a tea from willow bark, which she knew would ease his pain and help bring down the fever that was already making his skin burn beneath her fingers. All through that long night, Mara sat beside the stranger and tended to him. She bathed his forehead with cool water when the fever raged and covered him with both her blanket and her own cloak when he shivered with cold. She trickled the willow bark tea between his cracked lips whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through the cottage's single window, Mara realized she had not slept at all, nor had she eaten since the previous morning. But she could not rest, not while this man's life hung in the balance. She laid fresh wood on the fire and prepared more poultice, wondering who this stranger was and how he had come to be wounded and alone in her forest. For 3 days and 3 nights, the stranger lay between life and death, while Mara tended him without rest or reprieve. The fever came and went in terrible waves, and during its height, the man would cry out and thrash upon the bed, speaking words in a delirium that Mara could not comprehend. She would hold him down gently, speaking soft words of comfort, though she doubted he could hear her. She gave him sips of broth made from the last of her vegetables, and more of the willow bark tea to ease his pain. Every few hours, she would change his bandages, which became soaked through with blood and the weeping fluids from the wound. Mara's own exhaustion grew with each passing hour. She dozed fitfully in the chair beside the bed, waking at every sound the stranger made. Her small store of food dwindled to almost nothing, but she gave what little she had to the man, knowing he needed it more than she did. Her cottage, usually neat and orderly, became cluttered with pots of herbs, strips of bandages, and bowls of water. She had no time to go to the market, no time to gather mushrooms or berries. All that mattered was keeping this stranger alive. On the 4th day, as dawn broke cold and clear, something changed. The fever finally broke, and the stranger's breathing became deeper, more regular. His skin, which had been burning to the touch, cooled to a more natural temperature. Mara, who had been changing his bandages, noticed that his eyes had opened and were watching her with clarity for the first time since she had found him. They were remarkable eyes. She noticed a deep brown that seemed to hold intelligence and depth even in his weakened state. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice weak but coherent at last. Mara sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, with her hair tangled and her dress stained with his blood. "I am Mara," she said quietly, "and this is my cottage. You were dying in the forest, and I brought you here." The stranger tried to sit up, but was far too weak. He fell back against the pillows, her only pillows, which she had given to him with a soft groan. She reached for a cup of water and helped him drink, supporting his head with her hand. "What is your name?" Mara asked when he had drunk his fill. The stranger hesitated, and Mara saw something flicker in his eyes, caution perhaps, or fear. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Lucien," he said simply. Mara nodded, sensing that there was more he was not telling her, but she did not press him. Perhaps he had lost his memory from the trauma of his wounds. Such things were not unheard of. She settled back into her chair, relief washing over her now that he was conscious and coherent. "Tell me, Lucien," she said gently, "how did you come to be wounded and alone in the forest?" Again the stranger hesitated, his eyes moving to the window as if searching for answers in the pale morning light. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something Mara could not quite identify. Was it shame? Sorrow? "I was attacked by bandits," he said slowly. "They robbed me and left me for dead. I remember very little after that, until I woke here and saw your face." Mara studied him carefully, noting the fine quality of his torn and bloodied clothes, the smoothness of his hands despite his obvious strength. She wondered again who this man truly was, but she kept her questions to herself. Time enough for answers when he was stronger. As the days passed, Lucian grew steadily stronger, though he was still far too weak to leave the cottage, or even to stand for more than a few moments at a time. Mara continued to tend to him with the same care she had shown from the beginning, changing his bandages regularly and ensuring he ate the simple meals she prepared. She brought him her plain bread and thin vegetable soup, apologizing for the meager fare, but Lucian thanked her for each bowl as if it were a feast fit for royalty. His gratitude was genuine and touching, and Mara found herself warming to this mysterious stranger despite her natural caution. She began to notice things about him that puzzled her. Despite the blood and dirt that had covered him when she found him, she could see now that his clothes, though torn, were made of the finest materials, silk and velvet, that no common traveler would possess. His hands, though strong, were not the rough, calloused hands of a working man or a farmer. They were smooth and well kept, the hands of someone who had never known hard labor. And when he spoke, his words were educated and refined, his accent that of someone well-bred and cultured. Who was this man? A wealthy merchant, perhaps? A nobleman's son fallen on hard times? Mara wondered but did not ask. She sensed that Lucian was keeping secrets, but she respected his privacy. After all, he owed her nothing beyond his thanks, and she had helped him out of simple human kindness, not for any reward or explanation. Still, her curiosity grew with each passing day. One morning, as she brought him his breakfast of bread and honey, a rare treat she had bartered for with her last basket of mushrooms, Lucian stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Mara," he said seriously, his brown eyes meeting hers, "I want you to know that you have saved my life. You have given me your own bed while you sleep on the hard floor beside the fire. You have shared your food with me, though you have barely enough for yourself. You have tended my wounds and asked nothing in return. How can I ever repay such kindness?" Mara felt her cheeks flush at his words. She set the bowl down on the small table beside the bed and busied herself straightening the blanket to hide her embarrassment. "You owe me nothing," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "Any decent person would have done the same. I could not have left you there to die." But Lucian shook his head firmly, reaching out to still her hands as they fussed with the blanket. "Not any person would have helped a stranger," he insisted. "Many would have walked past, too afraid or too indifferent to get involved. Many would have feared bandits or danger. But you risked yourself to help me, knowing nothing about who I was or whether I even deserved your help. You have a good heart, Mara. That is a rare and precious thing." His words made Mara's heart beat faster, though she could not have said why. She pulled her hands gently away and picked up the broom, sweeping the already clean floor with more vigor than necessary. "Eat your breakfast before it grows cold," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "You need to keep your strength up if you are ever to heal properly." Lucian smiled at her, the first real smile she had seen from him, and obediently picked up the spoon. As Mara swept, she could feel his eyes upon her, and for reasons she did not fully understand, the small cottage suddenly seemed warmer, despite the autumn chill that pressed against the walls. After 2 weeks had passed since that fateful day in the forest, Lucian was at last able to walk about the cottage without assistance, and even to step outside for short periods, breathing in the cool autumn air. Mara could see that he was restless, eager to be fully recovered, yet something seemed to hold him back from speaking of leaving. There was a tension in him that she could not quite understand, as if he were wrestling with some internal conflict. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, and Mara would work on mending her clothes while Lucian watched the flames, lost in thought. One such evening, as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls, Lucian suddenly turned to face her. His expression was serious, almost grave, and Mara felt her heart skip with sudden apprehension. Had he decided to leave? Had she done something wrong? "Mara," he began slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. I must tell you the truth about who I am, for you have earned my honesty with your kindness, and I can no longer deceive you. Mara set down her needle and thread, giving him her full attention. She had known from the beginning that there was more to his story than he had told her, but she had never expected what came next. I am not simply Lucian, as I told you, he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. I am Prince Lucian, the only son of the king of this land. The cup Mara had been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered upon the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the small cottage. For a moment, she could not move, could not breathe, could not think. A prince? She finally whispered, her voice barely audible. You are a prince? Lucian nodded, his eyes filled with something that looked like apology. Yes. I was traveling through the forest in disguise, as I often do when I wish to escape the confines of the castle when I was set upon by bandits. They did not know my true identity, thank the heavens, or they might have held me for ransom instead of simply taking my horse and my purse. They left me to die, and I surely would have died if you had not found me. Mara knelt to pick up the broken pieces of the cup, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the fragments. A prince. She had been sharing her humble cottage with a prince, ordering him about like a common invalid, scolding him when he tried to help with chores. She felt her face burn with embarrassment and something else, a deep, aching awareness of the vast chasm that separated their stations. You should have told me, she said quietly, not looking at him as she gathered the broken pottery. I would have. I should have. But she didn't know how to finish the sentence. What would she have done differently? That is precisely why I did not tell you, Lucian said gently. He rose from his chair and knelt beside her, helping her collect the pieces. I feared that you would no longer treat me as a man but as a prince. Here in your cottage, I have been simply Lucian. You have scolded me when I tried to work too hard before I was fully healed. You have laughed at my clumsy attempts to help you prepare meals. You have treated me as an equal, and I have never known such simple, genuine kindness. In the castle, everyone bows and scrapes and calls me Your Highness and watches every word they say to me, but you spoke to me plainly, without fear or pretense. You saw only a man who needed help, not a title or a crown. He looked at her earnestly, his hand covering hers. I am sorry for deceiving you, Mara. Can you forgive me? Mara looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the fine features and educated speech to the genuine sincerity in his eyes. She thought of how he had thanked her for every meal, how he had insisted on helping despite his weakness, how they had talked easily by the fire in the evenings. I understand, she said finally, her voice steadier now. But you must return to your castle now. Your family must be worried sick about you. The entire kingdom must be searching. Lucian nodded slowly, reluctantly. Yes, I know. I must send word that I am alive. But, Mara. He hesitated, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. I do not wish to leave just yet. I should have told you sooner, Lucian said, his voice filled with regret. I know that now, but I was afraid. Mara looked up at him in confusion, still kneeling on the floor amid the broken pottery. Afraid of what? She asked. What could a prince possibly fear from a poor forest girl? Lucian's hand tightened gently on hers. Afraid that you would no longer treat me as you have been treating me, he explained. Afraid that you would start bowing and calling me Your Highness and watching every word you said to me, the way everyone else does. He helped her to her feet, and they both moved back to sit by the fire, though Mara felt strangely awkward now, unsure of how to position herself or where to look. Everything had changed with his revelation, and yet nothing had changed. He was still the same man she had been caring for these past weeks, and yet he was also someone entirely different, someone from a world she could barely imagine. Here in your cottage, Lucian continued, staring into the flames. I have been simply Lucian. When I tried to work too hard before I was healed, you scolded me like you would scold any foolish man. When I made a mess trying to help you prepare meals, you laughed at my clumsiness. When I asked you questions about your life, you answered me honestly, without artifice or flattery. He turned to look at her, and Mara saw such earnestness in his expression that it made her heart ache. "You treated me as an equal," he said softly, "and I have never known such simple, genuine kindness. In the castle, every interaction is calculated, every word weighed and measured. Everyone bows and calls me Your Highness and watches their every word, afraid of giving offense or missing an opportunity for advancement. My entire life has been lived under the weight of expectation and protocol. But here," he gestured around the small cottage, "here I have been free to just be myself, to talk without having my words analyzed for hidden meanings, to eat a simple meal without ceremony or pretense, to sit by a fire and know that the person across from me cares whether I live or die, not because of my title, but because they are a good person." Mara felt tears prick her eyes at his words. She understood what he was trying to tell her, though it made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully articulate. "I am sorry for deceiving you," Lucien said again. "It was wrong of me to lie, even by omission. Can you forgive me, Mara?" She looked at him for a long moment, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Part of her was angry that he had kept such a monumental secret from her. Part of her was terrified of what his revelation meant, not just for their current situation, but for what might come next. But the largest part of her understood why he had done it, and could not bring herself to be angry. "I understand," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "And I forgive you. But Lucien, Your Highness." She stumbled over the title, and it felt wrong in her mouth. "You must return to your castle now. Your family must be worried sick about you. They must think you're dead. You have duties, responsibilities. Your father, the king, needs you." Lucien nodded slowly. "You are right, of course. I will write a letter first thing tomorrow morning and ask you to take it to the nearest town, to the captain of the guard. They will come for me, and I will return to the castle." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "But I do not wish to leave just yet." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mara felt her breath catch in her throat, and she found she could not look at him. Instead, she stared at the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, and wondered how everything had become so complicated so quickly. Just a few weeks ago, she had been alone in her cottage, living her simple life. Now nothing would ever be the same again. "I should prepare some supper," she said finally, standing up with perhaps more haste than was necessary. "You must be hungry." She moved to the cupboard, grateful for something to do with her hands, and tried not to think about what would happen when the prince finally left her cottage and returned to his royal life, leaving her alone once more in the forest. The next morning, Lucien sat at Mara's small wooden table and wrote a letter on a piece of parchment he had torn from a small journal he kept in his pocket, one of the few possessions the bandits had not stolen. His handwriting was elegant and precise, the script of someone who had been educated by the finest tutors. When he had finished, he sealed it carefully and handed it to Mara with detailed instructions. "Take this to the nearest town," he told her. "Ask for the captain of the guard and give it directly to him. Tell him that Prince Lucien is safe and recovering, and that he should bring this information immediately to the castle but should come discreetly to retrieve me. The fewer people who know where I have been, the better." Mara nodded and took the letter, tucking it carefully into her apron. The journey to town would take most of the day, but she did not mind. In truth, she welcomed the chance to be away from the cottage, to have time alone with her thoughts, which had been in turmoil since Lucien's revelation the previous evening. She set out early, walking along the forest path to the road that led to the town. The autumn day was crisp and clear, and the trees blazed with color overhead. As she walked, Mara tried to sort through her confused feelings. In just a few days, perhaps tomorrow, Lucien would leave and return to his world of castles and kingdoms, and she would return to her simple life in the forest. It was right and proper that it should be so, and yet the thought of his departure filled her with a sadness she could not fully explain. She found the captain of the guard at the town's garrison, a stern-faced man with graying hair and shrewd eyes. When she gave him the letter and relayed Lucien's message, the captain's eyes widened in shock and then narrowed with suspicion. He questioned her closely about where she had found the prince, what his condition was, and how she came to be caring for him. Mara answered as simply and honestly as she could, though she felt his scrutiny like a physical weight. Finally, satisfied that she was telling the truth, the captain nodded briskly and assured her that he would send word to the castle immediately and that a contingent would arrive to escort the prince home within 2 days. Mara returned to her cottage by evening, tired from the long walk but relieved to have completed her task. She found Lucien sitting outside on the small bench beside her door, watching the sun set behind the trees. He looked stronger than he had in days, almost back to his full health, though she could still see the lines of pain around his eyes when he moved too quickly. When he saw her approaching, he stood and smiled, and Mara's heart did something strange in her chest. "It is done," she told him. "The captain said they would come within 2 days." Lucien nodded slowly, his smile fading. 2 days, he repeated quietly. They spent the evening preparing a simple meal together, working in comfortable silence. Mara had grown so accustomed to his presence in her cottage that she could hardly remember what it had been like to be alone. As night fell, they sat by the fire as they had done so many evenings before, but tonight the air between them felt different, charged with an awareness that their time together was drawing to a close. "What will happen when you return?" Mara asked finally, breaking the silence. "Will you be in trouble for running off as you did?" Lucien shook his head. "My father will be angry that I took such a risk, venturing into the forest without proper escort, but he will also be relieved that I am alive. They must have thought me dead these past weeks." He paused, staring into the fire. "There will be celebrations, no doubt, feasts and ceremonies to mark my safe return, and then everything will go back to the way it was before." There was something in his voice that made Mara look at him sharply. "You do not sound pleased," she observed. Lucien met her eyes, and in the firelight, she could see the conflict written plainly on his face. "I am not," he admitted quietly. True to the captain's word, within 2 days a royal carriage arrived at Mara's cottage, accompanied by soldiers and servants in the king's livery. The king's own physician was among them, a portly man with keen eyes and gentle hands who examined Lucien carefully. "You are lucky to be alive, Your Highness," the physician pronounced when he had finished his examination. "Another day without care, and the wounds would have festered and killed you." He turned to Mara with respect evident in his expression. "You saved the prince's life, young woman. The king will wish to thank you personally." But Mara shook her head quickly, feeling panic rise in her chest at the thought of going to the castle. "I need no thanks," she said firmly. "I am only glad that His Highness will recover fully." The servants had brought fine clothes for Lucien and rich foods. They wanted him to return to the castle immediately, but Lucien insisted on staying one more night in Mara's cottage. That evening, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows through the forest, Lucien asked Mara to walk with him. The soldiers and servants had set up camp a short distance from the cottage, giving them privacy, though Mara was acutely aware of the guards watching from a respectful distance. They walked in silence at first, following the same paths through the forest that Mara had walked 1,000 times before. But now, with Lucien beside her, everything looked different. The trees seemed taller, the colors more vivid, as if she were seeing her beloved forest through new eyes. Finally, Lucien stopped walking and turned to face her. They were in a small clearing where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "Mara," he said, his voice serious and intense, "I do not want to leave you." Mara felt her heart beat faster at his words, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to acknowledge the hope that fluttered dangerously in her chest. "You must return to the castle, Your Highness," she said, deliberately using his title to remind them both of the reality of their situation. "You have duties to your kingdom and your family. Your life is there, not here in this forest." Lucien took a step closer to her, and Mara found she could not back away, could not move at all. "What if I told you," he said quietly, "that in these weeks with you, I have been happier than I have ever been in all my years at the castle? What if I told you that I have come to care for you deeply, more deeply than I thought possible in such a short time?" Mara felt tears spring to her eyes unbidden, and she shook her head, trying to make him understand. "You are a prince," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "and I am a commoner. I am nobody. There can be nothing between us." You will return to your castle and marry a princess, someone worthy of your station, and I will return to gathering mushrooms in the forest and selling them at the market. That is the way of the world, Lucien. That is how things are." But Lucien reached out and took her hand in his, and his touch was warm and gentle. "The world can change, Mara," he said with quiet conviction. "I can change it. I am the prince one day. I will be king. If I choose to change the old ways, who can stop me?" Mara pulled her hand away gently, though it cost her more than she cared to admit. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold in the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "You speak of things that cannot be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even if you wanted to marry me, even if such a thing were possible, it would cause such trouble. Your family would be scandalized, the nobles would be outraged, the common people might not accept me. And in time, you would come to regret it. You would resent me for causing such upheaval in your life." "I would never regret choosing you," Lucien said fiercely, and there was such passion in his voice that Mara was forced to look at him. "Never, Mara. You are worth 1,000 princesses, 1,000 noble ladies. You have more kindness, more courage, more genuine goodness in your heart than anyone I have ever known at court." But Mara shook her head again, though tears were now streaming freely down her face. "Please," she whispered, "please do not make this harder than it already is. Tomorrow you will leave, and we will both return to our proper places. That is how it must be." For a long moment, Lucien said nothing. He simply looked at her with such sadness in his eyes that it broke her heart. Then he nodded slowly. "If that is what you truly want," he said quietly, "then I will respect your wishes. But know this, Mara, what I feel for you is real, and it will not fade simply because we are apart." They walked back to the cottage in silence, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. That night, Mara lay by the fire in her cottage one last time, listening to Lucien breathing in the bed that would be hers again by tomorrow night. She thought of how strange it was that only a few weeks ago she had been utterly alone, and now her heart ached at the thought of being alone again. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, her dreams were troubled and full of sadness. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the reality that Mara had been trying not to think about. She rose before dawn and prepared a simple breakfast, though she had little appetite. Lucien emerged from the cottage dressed in the fine clothes that the servants had brought for him, a tunic of deep blue velvet trimmed with gold thread, breeches of the finest wool, and a cloak lined with fur. He looked every inch the prince he was, and Mara felt the distance between them yawn wider with every passing moment. This was not the wounded man she had nursed back to health, the man who had laughed with her by the fire and helped her clumsily prepare meals. This was Prince Lucien of the royal house, heir to the throne, and she was merely a poor forest girl who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. The servants bustled about, packing everything into the carriage with efficient precision. Mara stood to the side, feeling like a stranger in her own home. She watched as they loaded trunks and boxes, as they arranged cushions in the carriage for the prince's comfort, as they prepared for the journey back to the castle. It all seemed so foreign to her, so far removed from her simple life. How could she ever have imagined, even for a moment, that there could be anything between her and this man? The very thought seemed absurd now in the cold light of morning. When everything was ready, Lucien came to her. They stood facing each other in the small clearing before her cottage, and Mara was acutely aware of the soldiers and servants watching from a respectful distance. Lucien took both of her hands in his, and his touch was warm despite the morning chill. "I will not forget you, Mara," he said, his voice low and intense. "I will never forget what you have done for me. You saved my life, yes, but you gave me something more than that. You gave me a glimpse of what life could be. Simple, honest, free from pretense and protocol. I will carry that memory with me always." Mara felt her throat tighten with unshed tears, but she forced herself to remain composed. She curtsied low, the way she had seen the servants do, though the gesture felt awkward and unnatural. "I wish you well, Your Highness," she said formally, her voice carefully controlled. "May you have a safe journey home." Lucien looked as if he wanted to say more, as if he wanted to close the distance between them and speak the words that hung unspoken in the air. But the captain of the guard was waiting, and the sun was rising higher in the sky, and duty called him back to the life he had been born to live. With visible reluctance, Lucian released her hands and climbed into the carriage. Through the window, Mara could see his face, could see the conflict and sadness written plainly in his expression. The driver clicked his tongue at the horses, and the carriage began to move, rolling slowly down the rutted forest path toward the main road. The soldiers fell into formation around it, their armor glinting in the morning sunday. Mara stood watching, her hands clasped tightly together, until the procession disappeared from sight behind the trees and the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. Only then did she allow herself to move. She turned and walked slowly back into her cottage, closing the door firmly behind her. The cottage seemed impossibly empty now, impossibly quiet. She looked at the bed where Lucian had lain for all those weeks, at the chair where he had sat by the fire, at the small table where they had shared their simple meals. Everything reminded her of him, and the weight of his absence was almost unbearable. Mara sank down onto the floor by the hearth and finally allowed herself to weep. She cried for what had been, for what could never be, for the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless road. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she sat in silence, staring at the dying embers of the fire and wondering how she would ever fill the emptiness he had left behind. Eventually, she forced herself to stand, to begin the process of putting her life back in order. She stripped the bed and washed the linens. She cleaned and scrubbed every surface, trying to erase the traces of his presence. She organized her herbs and her few possessions with meticulous care. But no amount of cleaning could fill the void in her heart, and when night fell and she lay down in her own bed for the first time in weeks, sleep was a long time coming. Weeks passed, and Mara tried desperately to return to her old life, to the simple routine that had sustained her for so many years. Every day she would rise at dawn and walk into the forest to gather mushrooms and berries. Every few days she would take her baskets to the market in town and sell what she had gathered, using the coins to buy bread and a few necessities. She tended her small garden, mended her clothes, and kept her cottage neat and tidy. On the surface, everything was as it had been before. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. The forest that had once been her comfort and her home now felt empty and hollow. The cottage that had been her refuge now felt like a prison. She found herself thinking of Lucian constantly, wondering what he was doing, whether he thought of her at all. Surely by now he had forgotten the poor girl who had found him in the forest. Surely he was busy with royal duties and courtly entertainments, surrounded by beautiful noble ladies who were educated and refined and worthy of his attention. The thought filled her with a sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. She had been foolish to allow herself to care for him, foolish to imagine even for a moment that there could be anything between them. She was nobody, and he was a prince. That was the immutable truth of their situation. One day, as the autumn was giving way to early winter and a cold wind rattled the bare branches of the trees, Mara was returning from the market when she noticed something unusual near her cottage. A grand carriage stood on the narrow forest path, its polished wood and brass fittings gleaming even in the gray light. 4 magnificent horses stamped their hooves and snorted clouds of steam into the cold air. Soldiers in royal livery stood at attention nearby. Mara's heart leaped into her throat. Had Lucian returned? But as she drew closer, her steps slowing with trepidation, she saw that the figure stepping down from the carriage was not Lucian at all. It was a woman, elegantly dressed in a gown of deep burgundy velvet with fur trim. Her hair was elaborately arranged beneath a small hat adorned with feathers, and jewels glittered at her throat and wrists. Her face was beautiful but hard, with sharp features and eyes that assessed Mara with cold calculation. "You are Mara?" the lady asked, her voice crisp and imperious. "Yes," Mara replied cautiously, clutching her empty basket against her chest like a shield. "I am Mara." The lady's lips curved in what might have been meant as a smile but looked more like a smirk. "I am the Countess of Ravenswood, and I am here on behalf of the king. We need to speak. May I come inside?" Mara's cottage was small and shabby, especially compared to the obvious wealth and status of her visitor. She felt acutely embarrassed by the worn furniture, the simple decorations, the smallness of everything. But she could hardly refuse a countess who claimed to be there on the king's business. "Of course, my lady," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She led the Countess inside, uncomfortably aware of the woman's critical gaze taking in every detail of her humble home. The Countess settled herself on Mara's only chair as if it were a throne, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. Mara stood awkwardly by the hearth, waiting for the Countess to speak. The Countess looked around the cottage with barely concealed disdain, her expression making it clear what she thought of the place where the prince had spent his recovery. "So this is where the prince spent his time," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "How rustic." Mara said nothing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The Countess's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Mara want to look away, but she forced herself to meet that cold gaze steadily. "I will be direct with you, girl," the Countess said, leaning forward slightly. "The prince has been different since he returned from here. He is distracted and unhappy. He refuses to attend to his duties properly. He speaks of you constantly, your name is always on his lips. He has rejected every suitable match that has been proposed to him. This situation is unacceptable, and it must end." Mara felt her heart beating fast, though she tried to keep her face calm and her voice steady. "I am sorry to hear that the prince is unhappy," she said carefully, "but I do not see what that has to do with me. I saved his life, and he has returned to his castle. That is the end of our story." The Countess's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do not play games with me, girl. You know perfectly well what this has to do with you. The prince is infatuated with you. He speaks of your kindness, your goodness, your simple honesty. He compares every lady at court unfavorably to you. He has refused to consider marriage to any of the suitable young women who have been presented to him. He claims that none of them measure up to a poor forest girl who knows nothing of courtly manners or proper society." Despite her efforts to remain composed, Mara felt a traitorous warmth bloom in her chest at these words. Lucien had been thinking of her. He had not forgotten her. He had refused other women because of her. But she quickly pushed these thoughts aside, knowing they were dangerous. "I understand that there can never be anything between the prince and myself," she said quietly, looking down at her worn shoes. "I know that perfectly well, my lady." The Countess leaned forward, her voice becoming urgent and insistent. "Then you must help me. You must write to the prince and tell him that you do not care for him. You must make it clear that there is no hope, no possibility of anything between you. Only then will he move forward with his life and accept his responsibilities." Mara stared at the Countess in disbelief, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "You want me to lie to the prince?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You want me to tell him I do not care for him when—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she had been about to reveal too much. The Countess's eyes gleamed with satisfaction at Mara's near slip. "Ah," she said softly, leaning back in her chair with a knowing smile. "So you do care for him. I suspected as much." She waved one beringed hand dismissively. "Yes, I want you to lie. It is for his own good and for the good of the kingdom. If he continues this foolish infatuation, it will cause serious problems. He must marry appropriately and produce heirs. The stability of the realm depends on it. A prince cannot marry a peasant girl, no matter what romantic notions he may have entertained while recovering from his wounds." Mara felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce, burning away the uncertainty and sadness that had plagued her for weeks. "I will not lie to Prince Lucien," she said firmly, her voice steady and strong despite the fear that made her hands tremble. "If he asks me directly how I feel, I will tell him the truth. I owe him that much. He saved my life by trusting me with his secret, and I saved his by nursing him back to health. I will not repay his trust with lies, no matter who asks me to do so." The Countess stood up abruptly, her face flushing red with fury. Her elegant composure cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "You dare refuse me?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You are nothing but a peasant girl living in a hovel in the forest. Who are you to speak of truth and feelings?" "The prince saved my life," Mara said, her voice not wavering despite the Countess's obvious rage, "and I saved his. That creates a bond that I will not dishonor with lies, no matter who commands it. I may be a peasant, my lady, but I have my honor, and I will not compromise it for convenience or political expediency." The countess moved close to Mara, so close that Mara could smell her expensive perfume and see the fine lines around her eyes that her powder could not quite hide. Her voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "If you truly care for the prince, you will do as I say. Your presence in his thoughts, your very existence, is preventing him from doing his duty. Do you want to be responsible for harming the kingdom? Do you want to be the reason that the royal line fails to continue? Think of the consequences of your selfishness." Before Mara could formulate a response to these terrible accusations, there came a loud, insistent knocking at the cottage door. Both women froze, startled by the sudden interruption. Mara moved to open the door, her heart pounding, wondering who could possibly be visiting her remote cottage twice in one day. When she pulled the door open, she found herself looking up at Prince Lucian himself. He was dressed in traveling clothes and looked as if he had ridden hard to get there. His hair was windblown, his face flushed from the cold and from exertion. But his eyes were fixed on the countess with an expression of cold fury that made Mara take an involuntary step backward. "I thought I might find you here, Countess Ravenswood," Lucian said, his voice cold enough to frost the air. He stepped into the cottage, and his presence seemed to fill the small space. The countess's expression transformed instantly from anger to a forced smile, her voice taking on a honeyed quality that made Mara's skin crawl. "Lucian, Your Highness, I was just speaking with this young woman. I came to—" But Lucian cut her off with a sharp gesture, his eyes never leaving the countess's face. "I know exactly what you were doing," he said. "I have had you followed since you left the castle this morning. I suspected you would try something like this, and I see I was correct." The countess's false smile faltered, and Mara could see fear flickering in her eyes beneath the anger. "I was trying to protect you and the kingdom, Your Highness," she said, her voice losing some of its confidence. "This girl, this situation, it is untenable. You must see that." Lucian stepped closer to the countess, and despite being a head taller than her, she seemed to shrink before him. "The only threat to me or the kingdom," he said, his voice soft but filled with steel, "is those who would try to control my heart and my choices. You came here to threaten Mara, to try to force her to lie to me and push me away. You came here thinking you could manipulate us both like pieces on a game board, but you were wrong, Countess. Mara has more integrity in her smallest finger than you have in your entire body." The Countess drew herself up, trying to regain some of her lost dignity. "I was acting in your best interests, Your Highness." The council, but Lucian interrupted her again, his patience clearly at an end. "The council does not rule me, Countess, nor do you. You will leave now and return to the castle. And you will tell the council and anyone else who asks that I will not be dictated to in matters of my heart. Is that clear?" For a moment, the countess looked as if she might argue further, but something in Lucian's expression made her think better of it. She gathered her skirts with shaking hands and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at Mara with an expression of pure venom. "You will regret this," she hissed. "Both of you will regret this." Then she swept out of the cottage, and they could hear her giving sharp commands to her driver before the carriage rolled away. When the sound of the carriage had faded, Lucian turned to face Mara. The coldness in his expression melted away, replaced by something warm and tender that made Mara's breath catch in her throat. "I came here today to ask you a question," he said quietly, stepping closer to her. "And I will not let the countess or anyone else prevent me from asking it." Mara found she could barely breathe. "What question?" she whispered. Lucian reached out and took both of her hands in his, and his touch was warm and steady. "I have thought of nothing but you since I left this cottage weeks ago. Every day in the castle felt like a prison. Every conversation felt hollow. Every meal tasted like ash. The noble ladies they paraded before me seemed empty and false compared to you. Mara, will you come back with me?" Mara looked from Lucian's earnest face to the door through which the countess had just departed, her mind whirling with confusion and fear, and something that felt dangerously like hope. "Come back with you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To the castle? But the countess was right about one thing. I am a commoner, and you are a prince. I do not know the first thing about life at court. I would not know how to behave, what to say, how to dress. I would embarrass you at every turn." But Lucian shook his head firmly. You could never embarrass me, Mara. Your honesty, your kindness, your genuine goodness, these are worth more than all the courtly manners in the world." Before Mara could respond to Lucien's question, there came another loud knocking at the door. She opened it once more, her cottage having seen more visitors in one day than it typically saw in a month. This time, however, her breath caught in her throat at the sight before her. Standing on her threshold was an elderly man dressed in the finest robes she had ever seen, with a crown upon his head that glittered with jewels even in the gray afternoon light. Behind him stood a contingent of royal guards and advisors. It was the king himself. Mara immediately fell to her knees, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Rise, child," the king said gently, his voice surprisingly kind for someone of such immense power and authority. He reached down and helped her to her feet with his own hands, an act of humility that stunned her. "You are the woman who saved my son's life," he continued, his keen eyes studying her face with interest. "Lucien has told me everything, how you found him dying in the forest, how you gave him your own bed and your food, how you nursed him back to health, asking nothing in return. He has also told me that he loves you and wishes to marry you, and he has told me that if I do not give my blessing to this union, he will renounce his title and leave the court forever." Mara's eyes flew to Lucien in alarm, but he met her gaze steadily, without apology or regret. She turned back to the king, her voice trembling. "Your Majesty, I never asked for, I never intended." But the king held up his hand, silencing her gently. "I know, child. I know. Lucien has made that clear as well. You did not scheme or plot to win my son's heart. You simply showed him kindness when he needed it most, and love grew from that kindness as naturally as flowers bloom in spring." The king moved past her into the cottage, and his advisors and guards remained outside, giving them privacy. He looked around the small, shabby room with the same critical eye the countess had used, but without the contempt. Instead, his expression was thoughtful. "My son spent weeks in this cottage," the king said quietly, almost to himself. "He slept in that bed, ate at that table, sat by that fire. And in those weeks, he found something he had never known in all his years at the castle: simple happiness, genuine companionship, and true love." He turned to face Mara and Lucien, who stood side by side now, their hands clasped together. "I will not lie to you, Mara," the king continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This is not the match I would have chosen for my son. I had hoped he would marry a princess or at least a noblewoman of high rank, someone who could bring alliances and strengthen the kingdom. Your marriage will cause talk, perhaps even scandal. There will be those at court who disapprove, who whisper behind their hands and question my judgment in allowing it." Mara felt her heart sink, her brief flicker of hope extinguishing like a candle in the wind. Of course the king would forbid the match. How could she have thought otherwise? But then the king smiled, and his entire face transformed, becoming warm and almost mischievous. "However," he said, "I have learned in my long life that happiness is more precious than gold or titles or political alliances. I have learned that a kingdom is only as strong as the happiness of its people, and that includes my son. Lucien has been a dutiful son all his life. He has never asked me for anything for himself, never shirked his responsibilities, never caused trouble or scandal. Until now, he has done everything I have asked of him without complaint. How can I deny him the one thing he truly wants, the one thing that will bring him genuine happiness?" The king took Mara's hand and placed it firmly in Lucien's hand, his grip warm and strong. "You have my blessing to marry," he said clearly and firmly, "so there could be no misunderstanding. You have my blessing and my support." Mara felt tears of joy streaming down her face, and she was powerless to stop them. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." The king smiled again and reached up to wipe a tear from her cheek with a surprising gentleness. "There is one condition, however," he said, his tone becoming more businesslike. "You must allow me to give you a wedding gift. I will grant you a title and lands of your own, so that no one can say you came to my son with nothing. You will be made a lady of the realm, with all the rights and privileges that entails." Mara began to protest, feeling overwhelmed by the king's generosity and uncertain whether she could accept such lavish gifts. Your Majesty, I do not need. But Lucian squeezed her hand gently, interrupting her. Accept his gift, Mara, he said softly. Let him do this. It will make things easier for you at court, and it will silence some of the gossip before it even begins. Mara looked at Lucian's face, saw the hope and love shining in his eyes, and found she could not refuse. She turned back to the king and curtsied as gracefully as her trembling legs would allow. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said with genuine gratitude. I am honored by your kindness and generosity. The king nodded with satisfaction. The wedding will be held 1 month hence in the castle chapel. That will give us time to prepare properly and to allow you to learn some of the ways of court life. Now, come. We must return to the castle and begin the preparations. But Lucian shook his head. With your permission, Father, I would like to stay here 1 more night. Tomorrow we will return to the castle together. The king smiled knowingly and nodded. Very well, 1 more night, but tomorrow you both return home. With that, he left, and his entourage followed. When they were alone at last, Mara and Lucian looked at each other in stunned silence. The enormity of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. Mara sank down onto her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Did that really just happen? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did the king really give his blessing for us to marry? Lucian knelt before her, taking both of her hands in his and pressing them to his heart. Yes, he said, his voice filled with wonder and joy. It happened. We are going to be married, Mara. You are going to be my wife. But even in the midst of her joy, Mara felt fear gnawing at the edges of her happiness. The Countess was right, though, she said, looking down at their joined hands. I have no title, no land, no fortune. Even with the title your father is giving me, I will still be nobody in the eyes of the court. They will see me as a peasant girl who somehow trapped a prince into marrying her. They will mock me and whisper about me. They will make your life difficult because of me. Lucian shook his head firmly, his grip on her hands tightening. Let them mock and whisper all they want. I do not care what they think, Mara. Do you not understand? I have known princesses and duchesses and ladies of every rank and station. I have danced with them at balls, conversed with them at dinners, been paraded before them like a prize bull at a market. And none of them, not a single one, has ever touched my heart the way you have. He stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in a way that made her feel safe and protected despite all her fears. None of them have your goodness, Mara, he continued, his voice soft and earnest. None of them have your strength, your pure heart, your genuine kindness. When I was dying in the forest, you saved me without thought of reward. When I was weak and helpless, you cared for me as tenderly as if I had been your own brother. When I told you I was a prince, you did not change how you treated me or start to see me as a path to wealth and power. You continued to treat me simply as a man you had come to care for. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. You are worth more than all the noble ladies in the kingdom, Mara. You are worth more than any title or fortune. But Mara shook her head, pulling away from his embrace to pace the small cottage. You say that now, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. But what about in a year? 2 years? 5 years? When you have grown tired of the gossip and the scandal? When you realize that I can never truly be the princess the kingdom needs? When you look at me and see only a poor forest girl who does not know how to behave at court, who says the wrong things and wears the wrong clothes and embarrasses you at every turn? Her voice rose with each question, all the fear and doubt she had been suppressing finally pouring out. You will come to resent me, Lucian. You will regret your choice. And I could not bear that. I could not bear to see love turn to resentment in your eyes. Lucian crossed the room in 2 quick strides and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me, Mara, he said intensely. I will never regret choosing you. Never. Do you understand? These weeks without you have taught me something important. I would rather live in this cottage with you, in this small, simple cottage, than in the castle without you. I would rather eat your plain bread and soup for the rest of my life than feast on the finest delicacies while sitting next to someone I do not love. I would rather be nobody with you than a prince without you. His eyes searched her face, willing her to believe him. If you are truly worried about life at court, then we do not have to stay there. I have an estate in the north, far from the castle and the court. We can live there simply and quietly, away from the gossip and the politics. I will give up my place in the succession. My cousin can inherit the throne instead. I will be simply Lucian again, and you will be simply Mara, and we will be happy together." Mara stared at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "You would give up the crown for me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You would give up your right to the throne, your position, your future as king? For me?" Lucian nodded without hesitation. "In an instant," he said simply, without a second thought. "Mara, you need to understand something. Before I met you, I was merely existing. I was going through the motions of my life, attending meetings, fulfilling obligations, doing my duty, but I was not truly living. You showed me what it means to truly live, to feel genuine connection and love. How could I possibly give that up for a crown?" "You are not asking me to give up anything," Lucian continued, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I am offering this freely, gladly even. Mara, I have known princesses and duchesses and ladies of every rank imaginable. I have been introduced to suitable young women from kingdoms near and far. I have danced with them, dined with them, conversed with them about matters of state and culture and art. And through it all, I felt nothing. They were beautiful. Yes, they were educated and refined and perfectly suited to be a queen. But none of them had your goodness, your strength, your pure and genuine heart." He reached up and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that had begun to fall down her cheeks. "These weeks without you have taught me something important about myself. I would rather live in this simple cottage with you than in the grandest castle without you. I would rather share your plain bread and soup for the rest of my days than feast on the finest delicacies while sitting beside someone I do not love. I would rather be nobody with you than a prince without you." Mara felt her heart breaking and mending at the same time, pulled apart by fear and stitched back together by hope. "But your duty," she whispered. "Your responsibility to the kingdom. How can you abandon that?" Lucian shook his head. "I am not abandoning anything. My father has given his blessing, remember? And if we choose to live quietly in the north, my cousin is more than capable of taking my place in the succession. He has always been interested in politics and governance in a way that I never was. The kingdom will be in good hands." He smiled slightly. "Besides, who is to say we cannot serve the kingdom in our own way? From our estate in the north, we can help the people directly improve farms, build schools, ensure justice is done fairly. Sometimes the best service to a kingdom is not done from a throne." Mara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that their love could overcome all the obstacles that stood in their way. But the Countess's words still echoed in her mind, filled with warnings about scandal and consequences. "What if I say yes, and in a year or 2 years you come to regret it?" she asked again, unable to let go of this fear. "What if your family turns you away? What if the common people scorn us? What if you look at me one day and realize that I am not enough, that I can never be enough?" Lucian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her so tightly that she could feel his heart beating against hers. "Then we will face those challenges together," he said firmly. "Mara, life is not without difficulties no matter what choices we make. If I married a princess, as everyone expects, there would still be challenges and problems. There would be political conflicts, personality clashes, the burden of expectations. At least with you, I would be facing those challenges with someone I truly love, someone who understands me and accepts me for who I really am." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes again, and the love and sincerity she saw there took her breath away. "You keep asking, what if I regret this choice?" he said softly. "But have you considered, what if I do not? What if this is the best decision I ever make? What if 20 years from now, we are sitting by a fire in our home in the north, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, and we look back on this moment and thank the heavens that we had the courage to choose love over convention?" His words painted a picture so beautiful that Mara felt her last defenses crumbling. "I am afraid," she admitted in a small voice, allowing herself to be vulnerable with him in a way she had never been with anyone. I am so afraid, Lucian. I am afraid of failing you, of disappointing you, of not being what you need me to be. I know you are afraid, Lucian said gently, stroking her hair with tender fingers. I understand. This is a great deal to ask. But know this, Mara, I will wait for you for as long as it takes. Even if it takes a year or 10 years or a lifetime, I will not marry another. I will wait until you are ready to take this leap of faith with me. His words were a vow, spoken with such conviction that Mara knew he meant every syllable. And in that moment, listening to his steady heartbeat, feeling the warmth of his embrace, something shifted inside her. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it became smaller, more manageable, overshadowed by something stronger and brighter, hope and love, and the courage to reach for happiness despite the risks. Mara looked up at Lucian, at his handsome face filled with such love and hope and patient determination. Her heart felt as if it might burst from the conflicting emotions warring within her: joy and fear, hope and doubt, love and uncertainty, all tangled together in a knot she could not seem to unravel. She thought of all the obstacles that stood in their way. She thought of the Countess's words, of the scandal their marriage would cause, of her own inadequacies and lack of preparation for life at court. She thought of 100 reasons why this could never work, why they should part now before they caused themselves more pain. But then she thought of the alternative. She thought of going back to her life in the forest, alone in her cottage, gathering mushrooms day after day, with only the memory of these weeks with Lucian to keep her company. She thought of never seeing his smile again, never hearing his laugh, never feeling his hand in hers. She thought of spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been if only she had been brave enough to say yes. And suddenly, the fear that had been holding her back seemed small and insignificant compared to the regret she would feel if she let him go. I need time to think, she whispered, the words painful to speak but necessary. This is happening so fast. Just this morning I was preparing to spend the rest of my life alone, and now everything has changed. I need time to process all of this, to be sure. She expected Lucian to be disappointed, perhaps even hurt by her hesitation. But instead, he simply nodded with understanding in his eyes. I know, he said gently, releasing her from his embrace but keeping one of her hands clasped in his. I know this is overwhelming. I know you need time, and I meant what I said. Mara, I will wait for you for as long as it takes. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, a gesture so tender and romantic that it made her heart ache. I will return to the castle and wait for your answer, he continued. But know this, Mara, I will wait for you for a month, or a year, or 10 years, or a lifetime if that is what you need. I will not marry another. I will not give up hope. I will wait until you are ready to take this leap with me, or until I am old and gray and no longer have a choice in the matter. His attempt at humor in that last statement made her smile despite her tears, and she squeezed his hand gratefully. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being patient with me. Lucian smiled, and it was a smile full of love and hope and absolute certainty. There is nothing to thank me for, he said. Love is patient, Mara. If I truly love you, and I do, then I can wait. I would wait forever if I had to. That night, they sat together by the fire one last time, not speaking much but simply being together in comfortable silence. Mara's mind was racing, turning over everything that had happened, examining her feelings from every angle. She knew that Lucian would leave in the morning, would ride back to the castle and his royal life, and she would be alone again with her thoughts. But this time, the loneliness would be different. This time, she would not be mourning something lost, but rather contemplating something that could be gained if only she was brave enough to reach for it. When at last they retired for the night, Lucian kissing her forehead gently before lying down on the simple bed that had been his for so many weeks, Mara lay by the fire and stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet enough for sleep. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with mist hanging thick between the trees. Mara rose before the sun, her body moving through the familiar routine of stoking the fire and preparing breakfast, even though her mind was elsewhere. She had not slept more than an hour or two, her thoughts churning endlessly like a mill wheel. Lucien emerged from the cottage looking as tired as she felt, and she wondered if he too had lain awake most of the night. They shared a simple breakfast in near silence, both aware that soon he would leave and she would be alone again with her decision. After breakfast, Lucien prepared to depart. He dressed in his fine clothes and gathered his few belongings. Before he left, he took both of her hands in his one last time. He said softly, "Take all the time you need, but remember, Mara, I love you, and that will not change no matter how long it takes you to decide." Then he kissed her forehead gently and walked out the door. Mara stood on the threshold of her cottage and watched him ride away, the sound of his horse's hooves gradually fading into the distance. When he was gone, Mara went back inside and tried to go about her day as usual, but everything felt wrong. She tried to organize her herbs, but found herself staring at the same dried plants for minutes at a time without really seeing them. She tried to mend her clothes, but pricked her finger with the needle 3 times because she could not concentrate. Finally, she gave up on being productive and decided to go into the forest, hoping that her familiar paths would help clear her mind. She walked without any real destination, following the trails she knew by heart, and eventually found herself at the old oak tree, where she had first found Lucien bleeding and near death. She sat down beneath its spreading branches, leaning back against the rough bark, and closed her eyes. "If only there were someone to tell me what to do," she whispered aloud to the empty forest. "If only I knew what the right choice was." As if in answer to her words, she heard a voice soft and ancient, like wind through autumn leaves. "Why do you look so troubled, child?" Mara's eyes flew open in surprise, and she saw an old woman standing before her. The woman wore a ragged cloak of indeterminate color and leaned heavily on a twisted walking stick. Her face was deeply lined with age, but her eyes were bright and knowing. Mara scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. "I am sorry," she said, feeling foolish. "I did not see you there. I did not mean to intrude." The old woman smiled, and her smile was kind despite the gaps in her teeth. "You have not intruded, child. This forest belongs to all who need it." She moved closer and sat down on a large root that protruded from the base of the oak tree, gesturing for Mara to join her. "You saved a man's life beneath this very tree, did you not?" she asked. Mara stared at her in surprise. "Yes," she said slowly, sinking back down to sit beside the old woman. "Yes, I did. But how did you know that?" The old woman's smile widened. "The forest tells me many things," she said mysteriously. "The trees have eyes and ears if you know how to listen. And now that man wishes to marry you, but you are afraid to accept. Is that not so?" Mara nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes once more. "I do not know what to do," she admitted. "I care for him deeply, but we are from such different worlds. I am afraid that I am not good enough for him. I am afraid that his family will hate me. I am afraid that the common people will mock him for marrying beneath his station. I am afraid that in time he will come to regret his choice and resent me for accepting it." She looked at the old woman with desperate hope. "How do I know if I am making the right decision? How do I know if love is enough?" The old woman was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching Mara's face with an intensity that made her feel as if the old woman could see into her very soul. The old woman's ancient eyes studied Mara with a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for a stranger. "Tell me, child," she said softly, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "What is it you truly fear? Not what you think you should fear, not what others have told you to fear, but what your heart fears most deeply?" Mara thought for a long moment, trying to articulate the tangle of emotions that had been tormenting her. "I fear that I am not good enough for him," she said slowly. "I fear that his family will hate me for taking him away from the life they planned for him. I fear that the common people will mock him for marrying beneath his station and that he will lose their respect. But most of all," she paused, her voice breaking slightly. "Most of all, I fear that in time he will come to regret his choice. I fear that he will look at me and see only a poor forest girl who embarrasses him with her ignorance and her rough ways, and that love will turn to resentment in his eyes. I could not bear that. I could not bear to watch love die slowly, day by day, until all that remained was regret. The old woman nodded thoughtfully, as if these fears were not new to her but rather old friends she had encountered many times before. These are natural fears, she acknowledged. Love always requires vulnerability, and vulnerability always brings the possibility of pain. But let me ask you something, child. When you found him dying in the forest beneath this very tree, did you stop to ask if he was worthy of your help? Did you question whether saving him would bring you any benefit or advantage? Did you weigh the potential costs before you acted? Mara shook her head. No, she admitted. I helped him because it was the right thing to do. I could not have walked away and left him to die. It would have been impossible. The old woman's eyes glittered with approval. Exactly, she said. You acted from your heart without thought of consequence or calculation. You did not ask what you would gain or what it would cost you. You simply saw someone who needed help, and you gave it freely and fully. And that, child, is why he loves you. The old woman leaned forward, emphasizing her next words with a gentle tap of her walking stick on the ground. He does not love you because you are high-born or beautiful or clever, though you are all of those things in your own way. He loves you because you have a good heart. And a good heart, child, is worth more than all the gold in all the kingdoms of the world. It is rarer than the finest jewels, more precious than the most valuable treasure. Most people spend their entire lives searching for someone with a truly good heart and never finding them. Your prince found you, and he is wise enough to know the value of what he has found. Mara felt something loosen in her chest at these words, some tight knot of fear beginning to unravel. But what if it is not enough? She whispered. What if my good heart is not enough to overcome all the obstacles we will face? The old woman laughed, a sound like water over stones. Love is not something that fades like the colors in cloth left too long in the sun, child. True love is not so fragile. True love grows deeper with each passing year if it is tended carefully, the way a gardener tends her plants. Will there be hardships? Yes, of course there will. Life is full of hardships for everyone, regardless of their station or circumstances. Will there be those who speak against you? Certainly. There are always people who disapprove of happiness they do not understand or cannot have for themselves. But if you and he face these things together, if you support each other through the difficult times and celebrate together through the joyful ones, your love will only grow stronger. That is the nature of true love. It grows deeper through shared experience, both good and bad. The old woman reached out and placed her gnarled hand over Mara's. The question is not whether there will be difficulties, child. The question is whether you are willing to face those difficulties together with him, or whether you will let fear steal your happiness before you even give it a chance to bloom. Mara felt tears streaming down her face, but they were different tears now, not tears of fear and confusion, but tears of clarity and release. You are right, she said, her voice growing steadier. You are absolutely right. I have been letting fear rule me instead of listening to my heart. I have been so focused on all the things that could go wrong that I have not allowed myself to imagine all the things that could go right. I have been so afraid of potential pain that I have been willing to give up potential joy. The old woman smiled and patted her hand. That is wisdom, child. That is courage. It takes great courage to choose love despite fear, to reach for happiness even when the path is uncertain. But I think you have that courage. After all, you had the courage to save a dying stranger in the forest, to give him your bed and your food when you had so little to spare. If you had that kind of courage then, surely you can find the courage now to save yourself from a lifetime of regret. The old woman stood slowly, leaning heavily on her walking stick, and Mara rose with her. The weight that had been pressing on her heart for weeks seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose that made her feel lighter than she had in a long time. Go to him, child, the old woman said, placing her hand on Mara's head in what felt like a blessing. Do not let fear steal your happiness. Life is too short, and true love is too rare to be cast aside because of worry about what might happen. The future is uncertain for everyone, prince and pauper alike, but if you have love, you have something worth building that future upon. Mara felt the old woman's hand on her head, warm despite the cold air, and she felt something pass between them, some kind of understanding or peace that was difficult to put into words. "Thank you," Mara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your wisdom. I do not even know your name, but you have given me a gift more precious than I can express." The old woman smiled mysteriously. "I have many names, child, and none. I am the wisdom that comes from listening to the forest, from paying attention to the whispers of wind and water. I am the voice that speaks when hearts are ready to hear." She turned to walk away, moving more sprilly than seemed possible for someone so aged. "Wait," Mara called out, wanting to thank her properly, to ask her more questions, to learn more from this strange and wonderful person. But when she looked up, the old woman had vanished, as if she had never been there at all. Mara spun in a circle, searching the forest, but there was no sign of the woman anywhere, no sound of footsteps, no movement in the underbrush, nothing. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the mist. Mara stood alone beneath the oak tree for a long moment, trying to understand what had just happened. Had the old woman been real, or had she been a spirit of some kind? Had Mara imagined her, conjured her from her own desperate need for guidance? But the warmth of the old woman's hand on her head had been real. The wisdom in her words had been real, and the clarity Mara now felt was certainly real. In the end, it did not matter whether the old woman had been flesh and blood or something more mystical. What mattered was that Mara had been visited by wisdom when she needed it most, and she now knew with absolute certainty what she needed to do. The fear that had been paralyzing her for weeks was still there. She could feel it lurking at the edges of her consciousness, but it no longer controlled her. She had a choice to make, and she had made it. Mara ran all the way back to her cottage, her feet flying over the familiar forest paths, her breath coming in gasps not from exertion, but from excitement and determination. When she burst through the door of her cottage, she immediately went to her small writing desk, a rickety thing she had bartered for years ago, and pulled out a piece of precious parchment. Her hand trembled as she dipped her quill in ink, but her heart was steady and sure. She wrote quickly, the words flowing from her pen as if they had been waiting all along for her to have the courage to set them free. She told Lucian that she had been afraid, but that she was afraid no longer. She told him that she loved him with all her heart and would marry him wherever and whenever he wished. She told him that she understood there would be challenges and difficulties ahead, but that she was ready to face them together with him. She told him that she trusted him and trusted their love, and that she was ready to take the leap of faith he had asked of her. When she had finished writing, she sealed the letter carefully with wax and pressed her thumb into it since she had no seal of her own. Then she grabbed her cloak and set out immediately for the town, not wanting to wait even one more day to send her answer. The walk to town seemed to take forever, though in reality it was no longer than it had ever been. She delivered the letter to the same captain of the guard she had met before, and his gruff face softened into something like approval when she explained what the letter contained. "The prince will be glad to receive this news," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "He has been like a man lost since he returned to the castle. This will bring him back to life." Mara thanked him and then walked back to her cottage, her heart both racing with excitement and peaceful with the certainty that she had made the right choice. She spent the next 3 days cleaning her cottage from top to bottom, organizing her belongings, and saying goodbye to the life she had known. She walked through the forest one last time, touching the trees she had known since childhood, gathering herbs from her favorite spots, imprinting the sights and sounds and smells of her home in her memory. She knew she would return to visit, but life would never be the same. She was about to step into a new world, a world of castles and courts and responsibilities she could barely imagine. But she was ready. Or at least, she was as ready as she could be. 3 days after she had sent her letter, a royal carriage appeared on the path to her cottage. But this time, when the door opened, it was not just servants who emerged. It was Lucian, and behind him, the king himself. Lucian ran to Mara the moment he saw her, crossing the distance between them in a few long strides. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, his face alight with joy. "You said yes," he breathed, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "You said yes. I can hardly believe it. When your letter arrived, I thought my heart would burst from happiness." Mara laughed, her own joy bubbling up and spilling over. I said yes, she confirmed, reaching up to touch his face with wonder. I was a fool to hesitate, to let fear hold me back. But I understand now. Love is worth the risk. You are worth the risk. She pulled him close and kissed him for the first time, a kiss that tasted of joy and promise and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, they turned to find the king watching them with obvious approval and perhaps a touch of amusement at their display. Mara immediately curtsied, remembering herself and her manners, but the king waved away her formality with a gentle gesture. There will be time enough for protocol later, he said kindly. For now, let us focus on the happiness of the moment. He came forward and took both of Mara's hands in his own, looking at her with warm eyes. Welcome to our family, my dear, he said. You are going to make my son very happy, and that makes me happy in turn. A king's greatest treasure is not his gold or his land, but the happiness of those he loves. Mara felt tears spring to her eyes at his words, overwhelmed by his kindness and generosity. Thank you, Your Majesty, she whispered. I will do my best to be worthy of your trust and Lucian's love. The king smiled. You already are worthy, child. That is why my son loves you. Now, come. We must return to the castle and begin preparations for the wedding. We have a great deal to do in the month ahead. The next month passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Mara's head spinning. She moved into the castle and was given a beautiful suite of rooms that seemed impossibly grand after her tiny cottage. She was assigned tutors who taught her the ways of the court, how to dress, how to walk, how to curtsy properly, how to address different ranks of nobility. She learned to dance, though she stepped on her instructor's toes more times than she could count. She learned the history of the kingdom and the names and titles of all the important families. It was exhausting and overwhelming, but Lucian was with her every step of the way. He attended her lessons when he could, encouraged her when she felt frustrated, and reminded her constantly that she was perfect exactly as she was. The castle staff, who had initially been skeptical of this common girl who was marrying their prince, gradually warmed to her as they saw her genuine kindness and her lack of pretension. She learned their names and asked about their families. She thanked them for their service and treated them with respect. Word spread that the prince's bride had a good heart, and slowly the castle began to embrace her. The wedding day finally arrived, and Mara wore a gown of silver and white that made her feel like someone from a fairy tale. Her hair was crowned with flowers from the forest where she had found Lucian, a request she had made that had touched him deeply. All the nobles and ladies of the court attended, and though some whispered behind their fans about the commoner who had married the prince, most were won over by Mara's gentle manner and obvious devotion to Lucian. The castle chapel was filled with flowers and lit by hundreds of candles that made the whole space glow with warm, golden light. Mara stood at the entrance, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. For a moment, she felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What was she doing here? She was just a poor forest girl who gathered mushrooms for a living. How could she possibly be marrying a prince? But then she looked down the long aisle and saw Lucian waiting for her at the altar, and all her doubts vanished. He was looking at her with such love, such absolute devotion, that she felt tears spring to her eyes. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. The king himself walked Mara down the aisle, his arm steady and supportive beneath her trembling hand. He placed her hand in Lucian's hand, with obvious satisfaction, and Mara felt the rightness of that moment settle deep in her bones. This was not a mistake. This was not a foolish dream. This was real, and it was good, and it was meant to be. The priest began the ceremony with the traditional words, but Mara barely heard them. She was focused entirely on Lucian, on the way his hand held hers, on the love shining in his eyes, on the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke his vows. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was clear and steady despite her nervousness. She promised to love him, to honor him, to stand by his side through whatever challenges they might face, and she meant every word with her whole heart. The priest blessed their union and proclaimed them husband and wife, and when Lucian kissed her, the entire chapel erupted in applause. Mara heard cheering and saw people smiling, and she realized with wonder that they were truly happy for her and Lucian. Whatever prejudices might have existed before, in this moment, The kingdom was celebrating their love. After the ceremony, there was a great feast in the castle's banquet hall. Long tables were laden with more food than Mara had ever seen in her life: roasted meats and fresh breads, vegetables prepared in dozens of different ways, pastries and fruits and delicacies from distant lands. Musicians played joyful tunes, and nobles danced in elaborate formations that made Mara grateful she had spent so much time with her dance instructor. Lucian and Mara sat side by side at the head table, and he leaned close to whisper in her ear. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft and intimate, despite the noise and celebration around them. Mara turned to look at him, at this man who had been willing to give up everything for her, and she felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied honestly. "When I found you bleeding in the forest, I never imagined that day would lead to this. I never imagined that saving a stranger's life would change my entire world." Lucian smiled and raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "it was not chance that brought me to that spot in the forest where you found me. I had a dream the night before I was attacked. In it, an old woman told me I would find my destiny beneath an oak tree. At the time, I thought it was just a strange dream, but now I wonder if it was something more, a prophecy, perhaps, or a message from the spirits of the forest." Mara's eyes widened as she remembered the old woman she had met in the forest, the one who had appeared and disappeared so mysteriously, who had given her the wisdom and courage she needed to accept Lucian's proposal. "An old woman," she repeated slowly. "Lucian, when I was trying to decide whether to accept your proposal, I met an old woman in the forest. She appeared suddenly beneath the oak tree where I had found you, and she gave me advice that changed everything. She told me not to let fear steal my happiness, that true love was too rare and precious to cast aside. And then she simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all." Lucian stared at her, his expression a mixture of wonder and understanding. "The same woman," he breathed. "It must have been. Mara, I think we were brought together by forces beyond our understanding. I think our meeting was meant to be." Mara nodded, feeling a sense of rightness and peace settle over her. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I think so too. The forest brought us together, guided us to each other, and now here we are, husband and wife, ready to start a new life together." She looked around the banquet hall at all the nobles and courtiers celebrating their union, at the king beaming with pride, at the servants who had become her friends, at the beautiful castle that would be her new home. Then she looked back at Lucian, at the love and devotion in his eyes, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Fear had nearly stolen her happiness, but love and courage had won in the end, and they would live happily ever after. The festivities continued late into the night, with music and dancing and celebration that would be talked about in the kingdom for years to come. But eventually, as the moon rose high and the candles burned low, Lucian and Mara were able to slip away from the crowds. They walked together through the castle gardens, which were beautiful even in the darkness, lit by torches and starlight. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn flowers and the promise of winter to come. Mara shivered slightly, and Lucian immediately removed his formal cloak and draped it around her shoulders. It was far too large for her, the hem dragging on the ground, but it was warm and smelled of him, and she pulled it close with a smile of contentment. "I still cannot quite believe this is real," Mara said softly, looking up at the stars that glittered overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. "This morning I was nobody, and now I am married to a prince. In a single day, my entire life has been transformed." Lucian stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "You were never nobody, Mara," he said firmly. "You have always been extraordinary. The only thing that has changed is that now the world knows what I have known since the moment I woke in your cottage and saw you caring for me, that you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever known. Your title may be new, but your worth has always been immeasurable." His words made her eyes fill with tears of happiness, and she reached up to touch his face tenderly. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. I did not know it was possible to feel this way about another person." "I love you too," Lucian replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I can express in words. You saved my life twice. Mara, once when you found me in the forest and nursed me back to health, and once when you agreed to marry me and saved me from a lifetime of living without the one person who truly understands me. They stood together in the garden for a long time, holding each other, neither wanting to break the spell of this perfect moment. Finally, Lucian pulled back slightly and smiled. "Come," he said, "I want to show you something." He led her through the gardens to a secluded corner where a small fountain bubbled peacefully. Beside it was a bench carved from white marble, and as they approached, Mara saw that it had an inscription carved into it. She leaned closer to read the words in the torchlight. "Love is the greatest treasure, worth more than all the gold in all the kingdoms of the world. I had this made for us," Lucian explained. "Those words are what the old woman told you in the forest, are they not? Or at least very similar. I wanted us to have a reminder of the wisdom that brought us together, a place where we can come when we need to remember what truly matters." Mara was overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. She sat on the bench and patted the space beside her, and Lucian sat down, putting his arm around her shoulders. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the fountain and the distant music from the celebrations still going on in the castle. Mara thought about her journey from the lonely cottage in the forest to this beautiful garden, from solitude to love, from fear to courage. It had been a long and difficult road in some ways, but looking back, she would not change a single step of it. Every moment had led her here, to this perfect evening, to this man beside her, to this new life full of promise and possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Lucian asked, noticing the thoughtful expression on her face. "I am thinking about how strange and wonderful life is," Mara replied. "If someone had told me a few months ago that I would marry a prince, I would have thought them mad, and yet here I am. Life takes us down paths we never expect, leads us to places we never imagined we would go. All because I happened to walk deeper into the forest than usual one autumn morning. All because I heard a stranger groaning in pain and chose to help rather than walk away." She looked at him with wonder. What if I had taken a different path that day? What if I had decided not to venture so far into the forest? What if I had heard you and decided it was too dangerous to investigate? Our entire story would never have happened. Lucian kissed her forehead gently. "But you did take that path," he said. "You did venture into the forest. You did choose to help a stranger despite the risks. And that tells me everything I need to know about who you are and why I love you. You have a good heart, Mara, and you act from that good heart without calculation or fear. That is rare and precious, and I thank the heavens every day that I was lucky enough to find you." Mara leaned against him, feeling safe and loved and utterly content. "So what happens now?" she asked. "What does our future hold?" Lucian was quiet for a moment, considering. "Whatever we want it to hold," he said finally. "We can stay at the castle if you wish and learn to navigate court life together. Or we can move to the estate in the north and live more simply, closer to the land and the people. Or we can do both, spend some time here and some time there. The choice is ours to make, and we will make it together." "I like the sound of that," Mara said softly. "Making choices together, facing whatever comes together. I do not know what challenges lie ahead of us, but I know that as long as we face them together, we can overcome anything." Lucian pulled her closer. "Together," he agreed. "Always together. That is the promise I make to you, Mara. Whatever life brings, whatever obstacles we encounter, whatever joys or sorrows come our way, we will face them side by side. You will never be alone again, and neither will I." They sat together in the garden until the celebration finally ended, and the castle grew quiet. Then, hand in hand, they walked back inside to begin their new life together. And as they went, Mara sent a silent prayer of thanks to the old woman in the forest, whoever or whatever she had truly been. Because of her wisdom and guidance, Mara had found the courage to reach for happiness instead of letting fear hold her back. And now, as she looked at her husband, she knew that they would indeed live happily ever after. Not because their life would be perfect or free from challenges, but because they would face everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing day. And that was the greatest treasure of all.